Let's go.
Welcome to the Soul Fam podcast, where we expand your personal universe. I'm Diana Marquetta, and in each episode, Soul Fam co-founder, co-creator Lexi Strummer-Solden and I interview the world's most rising and longtime experts in consciousness, spirituality, entertainment, healing, and science. From Earth's dimensions and dimensions way, way beyond. On the Soul Fam podcast, our frequencies are high and your heart chakras will open as these powerful voices of today share cutting-edge research, profound experiences, and valuable knowledge for your world in this out-of-this-world, thought-provoking, envelope-pushing interviews that could only take place right here on the Soul Fam podcast.
Welcome to the Soul Fam podcast. We are so excited to welcome Tiffany Yu, the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, as well as a former analyst for Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we have to ask. I mean, how was it working at Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg? Was it like exciting and glamorous? Anything you can share about how it was working for those places?
Yeah, and you'll get to read a lot of my experiences in the book. I actually had a great time. So I started out working in investment banking, covering healthcare companies. And part of that was the economy wasn't in a great place. It was 2008, 2009. And I kind of looked at all of the different industries that were being affected. And healthcare is one of those industries that is relatively agnostic to the economy. At the same time, I was kind of earlier on my own journey as a disability advocate and had always viewed my own disability through this healthcare medical lens, and was looking for ways that I could subtly advocate in some ways. So I will say at the time, and this was 15 years ago, the group I was in was known as the lifestyle group, which meant that out of all the different investment banking groups that you could be part of, even though the hours were still demanding, it was kind of known that we were treated maybe better than some of the other groups. So I don't necessarily have any war stories from my time working in banking. And interestingly enough, my last year at Goldman, I actually moved over to the campus recruiting team because I had such a great experience that I wanted to help play a role in, help diversifying the types of people who wanted to explore financial services as a potential career path for them. I kind of leveraged my finance background to get a job at Bloomberg. But interestingly enough, my role at Bloomberg actually started as a production assistant. So, you were saying you work on sets too. So my childhood dream was to become Katie Couric. And actually one of the press pieces I got for the book was with Katie Couric Media. So it felt kind of full circle. And so I was trying to figure out a way, as someone who didn't have a journalism background, how can I get experience in media, in journalism? So my resume went through, started as a production assistant, which was a contract role. I was paid like $18 an hour. Keep in mind, this is like 10 years ago. So $18 an hour. You said still.
In New York?
Yes, in New York.
Wow, ramen noodles.
Yeah, I took quite a pay cut if you take the $18 and multiply it times, like a 40-hour week. And then that you can figure out what my
oh, right. No, we got it. No, we know. We've worked at these rates.
But then, interestingly enough, one of my favorite parts, so one of the things about Bloomberg is that I think if you take some training or something, they'll actually end up covering your healthcare premiums. So I think if you do like your annual physical and you bring a report or something, and this was 10 years ago, so I don't know if it's different. So it actually gave me a glance in terms of, even though I was in a contract position, I moved from a contract position to a full-time role. So then I became a producer for one of the shows. I know this is much more information than you may be interested in.
We want this information.
No, we love it. It's great.
I felt like I got treated really well and my healthcare was covered, and as someone who's disabled, many of us in the community have, additional medical needs, which means more doctors, I call it like the alphabet soup of doctor's appointments. And to have those covered, that's huge. And now I work for myself, and it really makes me reflect on the quality of care when I was at a place like Goldman versus now like going out into the marketplace and like picking my own plans. Oh, and one other thing I'll add is while I was at Bloomberg, outside of my role as a producer at Bloomberg Television, I actually co-founded Bloomberg's Disability Employee Resource Group. And it's been around for the last 10 years, which is weird to say that it's already been 10 years.
I mean, I would think you have a journalism background. Diana and I work with, we do.
Yeah.
We work with
my background is in journalism.
You seem like you do.
And I've been at the Bloomberg office, by the way, so I know how nice it actually is and what a great place it is to work.
Yeah. My hours were 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. So I don't know if I loved those hours,
Right.
but I did it. I did it for a year. And then you know what I learned after the end of that? I said, I'm really glad that I at least tried, because that was my childhood dream. It was something I had aspired to want to do. I'm glad I got to see a small glimpse of it and realize, I think I want to do something that makes the news rather than be the one who reports on it.
You can still do it. You're young. You can still make listen, once the TV business is sort of out of the precarious situation that it's in, you absolutely can. It's never too late. I think one of the greatest things about media is that these days, we're encouraged to keep reinventing ourselves and learning new skills and trying different mediums. And I understand the childhood dream. Just, I would say, not as a toxic optimist, but as people who work with on-camera talent in our real jobs, you've got what it takes, Tiffany. You'd be surprised how you'd be surprised. You might surprise yourself if you.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the new dream is. Maybe a talk show or something. But this is why I love the current era that we're in, where I feel like the barrier to starting a podcast or starting to create a platform, even on social media, or even watching social media kind of become the new emerging media alongside all of these traditional outlets.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we have to talk about your book, although we can talk about everything all day. Okay, so in your book, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, you describe ableism as a system of oppression that devalues someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So for someone who may be a little unclear or foggy or not sure, we were wondering if you could maybe give an example of like an overt display of ableism, and then maybe something more subtle, but that's still not helpful.
Yeah, so maybe an overt example would be making fun of someone based on their mannerisms. So making fun of someone if their disability impacts their speech, or maybe there's someone who has tics or spasms in the way that they move about, or maybe they walk differently. Or even for someone like me, one of my arms is paralyzed, my hand looks different. Making fun of the way someone's body looks. So those are more like overt examples. I know I have some examples in the book of other overt examples, which could be, it's still legal in over 30 states to pay disabled people below minimum wage.
How's that possible?
It's still legal in over 30 states to force sterilize a disabled person, as we come off of the heels of discussions around reproductive justice. And those are some of the systemic ways. There are laws in place that say, hey, if you have a 14C certificate, and you can go online and search 14C, you can see a list of all of the employers who legally are able to pay disabled people below minimum wage. So why that is ableist is because it is devaluing someone based on their productivity or their labor, right? Or in the example of forced sterilization, it's devaluing someone's body and their ability to produce children based on their disability status and our assumptions of their capacity or capability to be a parent. And then some of the more subtle ways could be organizing an event and assuming that there will be no wheelchair users there. So the example I like to give is like going to a concert, and at some venues, the wheelchair accessible seating is all located in one area and only for one person who would be the wheelchair user. So assuming we don't have friends, but then also assuming that maybe hundreds of us would want to go to the concert. And if you've only limited it to one area where people can sit and they can't even sit with their friends. So I actually share the example of going to the Taylor Swift concert last year in LA at SoFi Stadium. And one of the things I found really fascinating is you could bring your ticket to, I think it was guest services or access services, and switch it to an accessible ticket. And in every section of SoFi Stadium, they had accessible seating, which also meant unobstructed view. So if you were sitting and everyone else was standing, you would still be able to view. And a lot of people don't realize this, but I got into a car accident as a kid. So not only is my arm paralyzed, but I also broke 2 bones in one of my legs. And while they have healed, I'm not able to stand for super long, extended periods of time. I think I learned that at Coachella. And so when I went to the concert, I'm like, and the Taylor Swift concert was like 3.5 hours. It was very well known that it was very long. And I was like, you know what? I think just for my own comfort, I'm going to get an accessible ticket. And I had a great time in my little accessible seating area. And I appreciate that I got to enjoy the tour the same way as everyone else. But I know I digress a little. So yeah, concerts
Not
are
at
just
all.
No, this is one of the ways.
Exist in certain places, or even weaponizing disability terms. So I know recently a lot of people have been talking about blind spots they have, right? But if you think about the term blind spot or the word blind spot, I would encourage people to think, number one, do you think that using that term might be offensive to someone who is blind? What are you really trying to say? Which you could say, hey, I have these areas where I lack awareness. And is there alternative language that you can use instead?
I have a dumb question, Tiffany. When you go to concerts like that, are you allowed, is there room for your friends as well? Or is it that you're sectioned off, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, at least for that concert, there was space, if I was with my friends, that we could all exchange our tickets for the accessible seating. And also keep in mind, literally in every section. So if you think about the stadium, you have the floor seating all the way up until like level 5. Every single area had its own accessible seating, which is also fascinating too, because it means that, depending on what tier of ticket you bought, you're still sitting in your same price tier. Again, with all of your friends as well, if they want to sit in the accessible seating area with you. I will say I went to that concert by myself, but...
Well, that's cool. Anyway, it's just interesting, the challenges. You don't think about it. So,
yeah. And
SoFi is a brand new stadium, so it's built for that. But let's go to the Coliseum in LA.
Or the Pantages.
Yeah, and I think it's, and I mentioned this in the book, I think privilege to me is not a bad thing, but it means that there are just things we don't think about, right? And, I'm someone who also hosted a podcast. It's currently on pause, I guess I'll say. Unclear when it will return, but it took me a while to get the podcast launched because I wanted to do it accessibly, which also meant making sure I had transcripts available. And if I were to share video clips, that they were captioned. And now there are so many tools available to be able to make that a little bit easier. As more of us, podcasts, people are, I've been seeing, I don't know if it's a trend or not, but a lot of people are starting podcasts and just thinking about the ways of assuming that someone who is deaf wouldn't want this information.
That's a really good point. And that is something that I think that Riverside, I think they just added something, Diana, so that we can do that. Sometimes with the AI, and this is something I could double check, but sometimes with the AI, it'll hear a word and we would say something and it would think it's something else. So sometimes it's like, woof, like that transcript is not totally accurate. So let's not put it out there. But yeah, and
also, I just want to say that sometimes it's even just saying, hey, this is an AI generated transcript, or making it an editable Google Doc that says, hey, here is the AI generated really rough transcript. If you have the spoons or the energy and want to help us clean it up, we call this like community care. Like, how can we all support each other in making things more accessible? And I will say that I am someone, I would not say I'm an early adopter to AI, but I do think that AI tools are making access a little bit more feasible and approachable for people who might feel daunted by the task. So at my nonprofit at Disabilities, we do host a podcast and we record ours on Zoom where they have like an AI meeting summary. I use that to be like, here are the podcast notes. Because at first I used to sit in and listen to the whole thing and come up with, here are all the different topics. And then Zoom will also help me come up with a very rough transcript that I'll include. And then we'll upload it to YouTube, which sometimes has a little bit of a better caption tool. But
yeah, all of ours are closed captioned and transcripted on YouTube.
That's super interesting because I use the closed captions all the time on things that I watch and listen to. And that's sort of, I know we're going out of order a little bit, but using the closed captions would that be an example of the curb effect?
Yeah. So it's called the curb cut effects. And essentially what the curb cut effect is curb cuts were actually this act of defiance by a couple of wheelchair users back in the 70s who wanted to be able to access sidewalks, but there weren't any curb cuts. So they ended up cutting these cuts into the curb so that they could get onto the sidewalk. And they realized that these curb cuts ended up benefiting so many other people. And I actually just had dinner yesterday with a bunch of new friends who all have kids, and they were talking about these wagons that they, put their kids in, or all their kids' toys. So for your wagon, for your strollers, for package delivery people, for someone like me who I travel quite a bit and I love wheels on anything on my carry-on luggage. And fascinatingly enough, luggage didn't have wheels until airports became wheelchair accessible. Like, even if you think back to the image of the old luggage, it's like this really large leather duffel bag. This wasn't even a duffel bag, a briefcase thing. So captions are an example of the curb cut effect, where something that was designed for or with the disability community ends up benefiting a lot of other people as well. And one of the things I actually learned recently about captions is that it helps with reading skills too. So if you have young kids, just having the captions on helps with that too. And I remember commenting on the post because a lot of people were saying captions are helpful for accessibility too. And I was like, yes, captions are helpful for access, but I also love learning this alternative use of captions for helping people with their reading skills.
I didn't know about, those people, those two who went and cut the curb, they are just these rebel badasses. That is, I feel like, Tiffany, you should maybe write the screenplay, right?
Ooh. As someone who lives in LA, so I have lived in many major cities. I've lived in DC, New York, San Francisco, and LA. DC to me is very like policy driven. And then New York to me was kind of like finance, fashion. And then San Francisco was about tech and innovation. And moving here has been about, I call it narrative change, but entertainment industry, media. I have yet to make much of a foray into that realm. And Lexi, you got to meet some of my friends who are really movers and shakers in that industry. So maybe they...
There were a couple of your friends, by the way, that panel, your friends and colleagues on that panel were amazing. And I know some are directors and producers and writers. So I'm just saying, like, that could be something that you guys discuss. I don't know. Maybe it's already in the works. Who knows? But that, to me, that's like one of those fascinating stories that these people are friggin' heroes and they sound so cool. And it just, in the dead of night, they go and I love that. That's amazing. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm going to stop on that.
No, don't apologize. And I do think about, there are a couple of reasons why I moved to LA, but I think about the ways that the work you do in the industry really helps shape and make history visible,
Right.
And the first display of that, so my nonprofit, we turned 15 this year, and essentially it's 15 years of Tiffany as a disability advocate, and I've been disabled for 27 years. And I've met so many friends who, when I meet them, would have to be maybe like I actually just saw a film that has been like 10 years in the works. And you all know this, but it takes a long time. It takes a
Yeah.
long time, I think, for these narratives to get realized. And I will say, I feel very grateful coming onto your podcast. And I also feel like I am part of what I'm hoping is a cultural shift around viewing disability stories and disability narratives as something that needs to be more mainstream. 5 years ago, I could tell you the number of disabled authors in my network as someone who has been building a community in this space for, at that time, was like 10 years. Now in 2024, I could probably name 10 friends who all have books, 10 disabled friends who either all have books out now or they're coming out in the next year. So I feel excited that things are changing. And even from like a Hollywood entertainment perspective, the fact that there was that panel at that event and there are more, in the Writers Guild and Directors Guild, and this is not my realm, but it seems like there are disability committees and the SG, what is the screen SAG?
SAG, yeah.
Screen
I was
Actors
like,
Guild.
this is how you know. I was like, SGA, no.
Close
But there
enough.
are disability committees and all of those that I think are continuing to push for and advocate for change too.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another statement in your book, and I think it was in your book, and it was also in the panel of your friends. And this was one of the main points of the panel. And this is something that I know that you talk about as well, which is that at any moment, a non-disabled or pre-disabled person might find themselves temporarily or permanently disabled. Let's see here. It is the only minority group that anybody can become a part of at any point in their lives. Non-disabled or pre-disabled people have as much of a stake in accessibility as disabled people do. So every time I read that, I'm like, yeah, that feels right. But how do people react to that? Are they in denial? Are they okay with that information? Do they think it won't be them?
Yeah. And I will say, in full transparency, I used to not share that because when you share it, I don't want to fear people or scare people into caring about accessibility. Because what I would tell them, because when you say, oh, you can join us at any time, then you think about how many people will say, well, like, that sounds scary. And then you you lean in with curiosity around potentially why. And a lot of their fears are that because the world isn't accessible and they see how their friends or other people who have disabilities are treated, we're either the heroes, the superheroes, or the tragic people or tragic figures. And I think what I'm hoping to lean into is disability culture and disability community. And so by saying, like, I'm also someone who acquired my disability very suddenly. At 9 years old, I was in a car accident. And I think I had to unlearn a lot of what I saw on screen about how disabilities were treated and root myself in community. And I heard someone yesterday they said, living with my disability might not necessarily make me proud, but being a part of the disability community and seeing so many advocates and movers and shakers just out there doing our thing, like, makes me proud. And actually, I haven't gotten to tell you this, Lexi, but I reflect on when we met, and I was there with my disabled friends who were just on this panel. My book has a bright orange cover. We're like passing around my book. We're all taking photos with it. And then you pull up my book on Amazon on your phone. And I think you order it right then and there.
Got it.
And I hope that for you and your kids or anyone that you know who might be disabled, they get to see us having a great time together in community. So yeah, I included that in a chapter called Why You Should Care About Disability. Part of why I wanted to make sure that I included that, and I think I also included that I didn't want to like scare people into caring about disability, is that if we all take a vested interest in accessibility, when and if we live the full, beautiful extent of our lives and we become disabled, things won't have to be so hard. it took me over 10 years before I started to meet other disabled people and find this incredible community. And my hope is, I dedicated the book to 9-year-old Tiffany. Like, I think about how first of all, I think about how I would never want a 9-year-old to experience the things that she does, but hard things do happen to kids a lot. Wars, cancer, sudden deaths, car accidents, so many, and then horrific things that I don't even want to name out loud happen to kids.
Right.
But if she had like possibility models, role models of people who had paralyzed arms or had limb differences or had different upper extremity disabilities that were not just Paralympians, but were investment bankers and, I don't know, working as production assistants, leaders in the corporate world, like then she could realize that, hey, all these assumptions that you think your life is going to be, it doesn't have to be that. And it doesn't have to be that hard. So that's why we say, even in the context of the millions of people who have joined the disability community due to long haul COVID over the last couple of years, first, I want to acknowledge disability grief is a real thing, especially if you acquired your disability or if it changes over time. I'm someone who used to write with my right hand, and now I've been left-handed for the last almost 30 years. My handwriting still sucks, but maybe I'll work on it because now I've been doing a lot of signings. And after I sign the books, I'm like, I don't really like my handwriting. But then I'm like, I'm writing with the hand that I didn't start out writing with. So I think it's okay. But give space for that grief, but also understand that the final 2 stages of grief are meaning and acceptance. And if and when you decide you want to ebb and flow into those stages, the disability community and our rich culture and history are here to receive you and embrace you.
Tiffany, why did you hide your disability for so many years?
That's such a good question. I think part of it was cultural. So as the daughter of Asian immigrants, interestingly enough, when I started doing this work, a lot of the positive feedback I got and the people cheering me on were other Asian women who I think hadn't seen someone be vocal about something they were really passionate or really cared about, or maybe were vocal about something that others might view as shameful. So in my specific family, a death in the immediate family, having an apparent disability, and having a traumatic event like a car accident happened, what all meant that somewhere in our ancestral lineage, there was bad luck for all of these things to happen. I want to acknowledge and have compassion for my mom's generation in believing that, but it ends with me.
Right.
And so I held on. So I also keep in mind that at 9 years old, I don't really think at 9 years old, you're like old enough to know what's going on, but you're also not old enough to know what's going on. And so I didn't really have a full grasp of not only like what had happened, but no one talked to me about it in a way that made me feel like I could go out and advocate for myself. So I even have this memory where every single year my mom would write me a note that I would hand to my gym class teacher that said, like, Tiffany can't use one of her arms. Like, please keep that in mind as you think about the different activities. I mean, I don't even know what the note said. But essentially what I would do I would take this note and I would hand it to the gym teacher. They would read it, nod, and then I'd walk away. And I wanted to share that because I didn't even use my voice. Everything about that was someone else is delivering this message. Let me give it to you. You interpret whatever's on that paper, and then I will exit the situation. It was almost like a messenger of someone else co-opting my story. But I was a kid, right? And so I didn't know. And so I wore long sleeves all the time. And essentially I kind of anchored myself to, some people call this whiteness, and all these other systems of oppression are, embedded within there. But I wanted to anchor to a non-disabled body. And in some ways, looking back, I wonder if my mom thought that me not being vocal about having a disability or not being able to use one of my arms would make things easier.
Or safer, even.
Right.
And
Protection.
Safer. Yeah, and protection. All of the above. And you know what's interesting? I'm actually in the process of editing a couple interviews that I have done with the disability community. And one of the interviews I did said, you know, sometimes people don't understand why we share our identities because they've been weaponized to become some political thing. But many of us share our identities so that we can find community and realize that we're not alone and realize that our stories and our diagnoses are valid. And when I heard that, I was like, yes, right? Like, I'm not coming out here to be, I don't have a finished thought there, but I really, really valued that. And it made me realize, okay, at 21 years old, 12 years after I became disabled, when I first decided that I wanted to explore what holding and embracing that identity meant, also meant that I found my voice. You know, if you want to turn it in, I wrote a book, you know, like I found a community and I realized that I didn't have to be so alone. And I actually think that part of the way that ableism really does continue to gain more power is when we become more isolated and excluded. It's almost like how the system keeps us disempowered by making us think we don't have any power because we're so isolated in one way or another.
Was that a turning point in college then for you?
Yeah. I still remember the day. It was October 22nd, 2009. And up until that point, you know, I had done the notes and then actually I hadn't dated until then. I was delayed on the dating, but I only thought of dating because even when I started dating, I would like wait until the fourth date to like tell someone about either my arm or the car accident. And the majority of the time they didn't even notice. But I'm also like, why am I waiting to share something that I literally think about every single day? You know, we were talking about zippers on the back of dresses or, you know, even a button on the back. Those are very difficult if you only have one hand. So yeah, I think that was a turning point. But there were a couple things that kind of led up to it. So part of it was doing a summer internship at Goldman and getting introduced to their disability employee resource group. And now here I am, this 20-year-old summer intern, getting to meet managing directors and partners at this firm. And for those of you who are not in finance, as a summer intern or even as an entry-level junior analyst, there's a hierarchy there. Everyone is scared of the partners and the managing directors. And now it's fun because like a lot of those partners and managing directors are my friends because we all grew up together. But yeah, part of it was being able to see the power of community, even of a disability community, while I was at this company that I had this internship at. And then the next part was I ended up doing, I was a resident assistant, like an RA my senior year. You're kind of like a fellow student who lives in the dorms, who does programming and ensures that living in a dorm is a safe space. I always provide explanations in case people are listening who have not lived in those types of environments. But as part of our RA training, we had to participate in this diversity training where they gave us a pie and they asked us to cut out 8 slices of it based on how important different aspects of our social identities were to us. It's called the Big 8. So this can range from your nationality, your race, your gender, socioeconomic status, religion, sexual orientation, disability identity. I may have missed one, but we cut out all these slices. And disability was, being Taiwanese was a large part of my pie. That was actually a big turning point for me in college too, was embracing my Taiwanese American identity. But then being disabled was a large part of my pie. And when I looked over my neighbor's pie, I saw that being non-disabled was the thinnest sliver of his pie, right? If you are not affected by disability, privilege essentially allows you to not have to think about it, right? You can opt out or you don't think about it, which is why I encourage people to think about all the different access features that we now benefit from that were initially designed for disabled people, because now we're all benefiting, right? And if we realize like electric toothbrushes and audiobooks and bendy straws and curb cuts and captions and text to speech were all originally made as access features that we now all benefit from. But yeah, so a combination of all of those. And then I was really involved in creating a Taiwanese American community in college for my first 3 years of university. So essentially what I knew how to do was start clubs. I did not think that on October 22nd, I was going to become a disability advocate. What happened on October 22nd was I said out loud this idea that I wanted to start a disability club after starting this Taiwanese club. And I said, but I don't think anyone's going to join. And then I had all these people in the audience say, I'll join. And a lot of them were like faculty members at Georgetown or part of the staff, or they went to local area universities around DC. But that became our initial working group. And it just continued to grow from there.
That is super cool.
Okay. I'm just thinking about accommodations. For my own son, he has autism. And when we think about, I don't know, I feel like I'm one of those boomers who was in a generation of if something's different about you, hide it. Just don't act different. Don't act weird. It's in many ways, maybe sort of some inherited trauma, maybe at least for some Jewish people from where we're from, they're just like, don't hide everything. Just act, assimilate, keep all your little Judaica stuff in a drawer. And maybe my particular family is a little more OCD about that than others. But it was interesting because my son's like, no, Mom, I want to know if I have autism. I just want to know. All right. So we go get tested. Yes. What would have been categorized as Asperger's a few years ago. Now it's autism. Through his IEP at school, he gets accommodations, one of which is voice to text for his essays. And it helps so much. And I remember when he was little and we were in the occupational therapy and sort of the behavioral therapy autism programs, which he didn't have a formal diagnosis, but they still gave us services, which was incredible. I remember they used social stories. So for autism, for my son specifically, sometimes when you're listening, there's a processing delay. But if you show him first this, then this, then this in a picture story, they get it. So I was like, man, we should use social stories for everything. And especially with kids who get overwhelmed, the picture schedule, first this, then this, then this. It's one of the easiest ways to provide accessibility. And I remember being really nervous about him starting kindergarten. And because he's mainstreamed, I brought an example of these social stories that work. First this, then this, then this. And his teacher, she was like, yeah, I do all that already. I do that for everybody. For everybody. Like, that's not, everybody gets those. And I was blown away. I was like, well, you're maybe the first and only teacher that I ever met who did that for everybody.
I love that. Just a slight call in. So OCD is a disability, and just encouraging people to lean away from using it in a pejorative manner.
Okay.
For not that, but yeah, I think what you're highlighting is
no, but let's talk about that. What would be a better, because I do think they may have some undiagnosed, but the way I did use it was sort of like not flippant, but it was a little bit like I could see that being hurtful to somebody who's like, actually, this is really hard for me. If somebody had the diagnosis, it would be hurtful. So instead of that, I could say maybe my family was more, they took that story even farther about needing to hide things. And that would be.
Yeah. And I guess I'll share too that when we use, because I think I used to use that too, right? When we say like, oh, I'm a little OCD or I'm a little ADD, and I want to say, and not having a diagnosis is a privilege. So if you believe if you self-diagnose, that is still valid too. But when we use them so casually, it actually deters people who may have those disabilities from seeking help. But yeah, I think reflecting on just how casually we use disability terms to describe things that may not be disabilities. But But I don't want to digress. And this is where it becomes interesting too, because it starts with language, right? You'll notice
Right.
in the book, a lot of part one, anti-ableism and you, is focused on inclusive language. And the beautiful thing about language is that we have so many different ways to express ourselves that don't view different disabilities in a negative way. But at the same time, you were talking about accommodations for your son and what's worked for him and the way that he learns differently, and being able to see that implemented by his teacher. And that is huge. So I don't want to digress and take away from that story and the ways that educators now are, I think, starting to incorporate people who have different learning styles in, like, just acknowledging that. And one of the things I think about too is, as a kid, and I think maybe I told you this when we met in person, as a kid, I have now learned in my 30s that I could have been eligible for an IEP, which is an individualized education plan, because I was now writing with my non-dominant hand. So I think for a couple of months after, I did get extra time, but then I didn't. And it makes me think about all of those years of handwriting essays or taking tests, writing with a hand that I didn't start out writing with, that didn't have to be so hard. Could have had that, could have continued having that extra time, but I didn't know how to educate myself that was available to me. And I also wonder if my mom didn't have the networks or the resources to know that was something, or maybe she just didn't want it to look like I was getting special treatment, which we want to also debunk the myth that accommodations are special treatment. Essentially, what accommodations are is they enable you to do the thing, they enable you to participate equitably. So if that's learning, sometimes I use an example of cutting steak. So for me, or eating steak. So if I want to eat steak now, I will tell the server if the kitchen can cut it into smaller slices before it comes out. When there was a long period of time where I love steak, or I would go to a steak dinner, I used to work in finance, so it would always be these like upscale dinners, and I could never enjoy the dish. So
Oh, wow.
now at the end of the day, if you eat meat or if you eat steak, like, we all just want to eat steak. We just have different ways of consuming it. And that's how I think about accommodations. It's, hey, the desired outcome is you want your child to learn, or Tiffany wants to eat steak. The way we do it may be a little bit different, but who cares? It doesn't matter how we did it. It just matters how you consume the information. Or sorry, it just matters that you consume the information.
Amen.
Interesting. It's all the little things you don't think about that you think about every day. And I don't mean to separate you from me, but it's a different way to operate. So,
And I think that's okay.
of course.
I think that, people will say, I guess this is my provocative thought, but people will say, like, oh, I don't want to be treated differently. Really, I think I just want to be treated equitably, which means we might be treating people in different ways based on what works best for them.
So what difference does it make? Here's sort of how I feel sometimes, or I'm hoping that things seem more seamless. Is that part of your hope? It seems like it's not a reach to like ask for your steak to be cut before it's served. There's just a normalcy.
Yeah,
Is that?
I think about the difference between accessibility and accommodations. So accessibility is, we have thought about all the different ways that people may engage with this space or this experience, and we have made it so that they show up and don't have to ask for permission to show up. This is also known as a phrase called access intimacy. Accommodations are, I'm showing up to a space, but someone forgot that someone like me might show up and has to put a bandage on. In Lexi's example, the fact that the kindergarten teacher had already does the learning or the schedule in a way that works best for her son is an example of accessibility, because he can show up and it's provided in a format that already works for him. So I share all of that to say, right now we are living in an accommodations culture, which means that we haven't thought about disabled people in these spaces. So we're tacking on bandages to different spaces. Even as we started the conversation saying, hey, SoFi Stadium was recently built, so Tiffany can show up and get her accessible seating ticket. But what about all these other venues, right? And so, Diana, I think to your point, if we think about building what I call an accessibility first culture, which is, to you, it's how can we make things more seamless, then we can all show up to that space. And, and I don't mean to use like no one cares flippantly, but I will say that some of the societal attitudes around disability end up becoming tougher for a disabled person to have to navigate. Like, I just want to go out and live my life. I don't want people staring at me about how I cut my steak or the way I, lift a package or something, and sometimes or like needing a seat on a bus, and people looking at me and assuming my age or assuming my disability status, or that I don't, or someone who is in chronic pain, just the assumptions that we make.
Right.
Hoping to get to a point where I can show up, and if I benefit from over-the-ear headphones, no one cares, because maybe loud noises or having too much, sensory input can be overstimulating for some people. So that's what my hope is. You called it a seamless experience. I call it access first. You could call it access intimacy. But essentially, again, I come back to this idea of how can I show up to a space and not have to worry that my livelihood will be impacted by the way I do my work. We were talking briefly before we started recording about accessibility on sets. I am 15 years into my career. The first question you asked me was these really these places that I worked that are recognizable names. And at the same time, I will get messages from people who are interns at large companies who are unsure whether to share their disability status or not. I will say, if you would like accommodations covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, you do need to share your disability status. But my hope is that, again, we create these spaces where we've already thought about all the different people who might engage with this space so that I can just show up and come and do my work. But sorry, I felt like I went on a little tangent there. But to wrap it all up,
We love tangents here.
I do wonder. Oh, sorry, what'd you say?
We love tangents.
Yeah, we're all about rabbit holes.
But I think what I was trying to say is, I don't know if 15 years ago, if I didn't have a Goldman and a Bloomberg and so many of the incredible experiences I've had over the last 15 years as receipts, that I could be writing this book. But my hope is, and again, I did dedicate this book to 9-year-old Tiffany, because 9-year-old Tiffany had no idea what resources and support and community were out there and available for her. And things were really hard until she was 21. I mean, and things are still hard in different ways, not because I'm disabled, but, or sometimes maybe, but not solely because of my disability status. So yeah, I do wonder if like part of it comes with time. Lex, you shared like being a boomer. There are things that are changing in between all of our different generations. I feel hopeful that the work that I've done and those who have come before me will help empower this next generation to really continue to think about access and the disability community.
It would be huge in the entertainment business. I'm just going to say that out loud. I've certainly been on sets recently where they were definitely not accessible. And
we were just talking about that, right? We're saying like, even if you're not part of the disabled community, if anytime we're not treated well, and this just goes against everything we've learned working out here in Hollywood up to maybe the last, 10 or 15 years, you don't complain, you make yourself available 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Because to say something like, you know what, my brain is just not it's not working today. I'm having a bad day. They'd be like, well, get your fucking shit together. Okay. How about that?
Or you
Stop
can leave.
yeah, or you can leave. Stop. That's literally it. Get your fucking shit together or just like get out. And so we're just thinking about it. It's like, maybe this is what we were talking about before is here's a rabbit hole. Because this is a spiritual podcast, I'm going to bring a little hermeticism into this, but there's the idea of as above, so below, right? We've got a macrocosm and a microcosm, sort of the idea that someone shared a long time ago, if you want to change the world, change yourself. So would that fit the idea of if you want to make the world more accessible, then advocate for yourself for how you're being treated unfairly, because it can only benefit the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, and actually I have a question for you because I consider myself like tangential to the industry, but I look at someone like Marlee Matlin, and I look at Ashley Eakin and Lolo Spencer and Nick Novicki. These were some of the panelists who are emerging in this field. And my question is, are you seeing a shift?
I'm seeing a little bit of a shift, and I would say that it's Gen Z. Gen Z, I've noticed they're very outspoken about invisible disability and mental health in particular. And it's just from the oldest Gen Zs to the youngest Gen Zs. And I count my son as one of the youngest Gen Zs. They're outspoken, they're non-apologetic about it, and it's beautiful and it's inspiring. And I think Gen Z's really led the way. So I would say that I noticed first with mental health, but when it comes to disability, I just noticed some disability advocates and speakers and creators showing up on the calendar of the place where I work. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And the fact that it just happened like after we met, I don't know if there's any synchronicity there, but I would say I'm starting to see a shift. We're like just cracking the door open, I think.
Yeah, and I think, to what you were saying before about like to transform the world, transform yourself, there's a through line through the book with the phrase, with this Instagram post that I saw a couple of years ago that said, ending discrimination starts with self-reflection. And so every single chapter in the book ends with reflection questions. Even chapter 1 that says the chapter is not disability is not a bad word, and the reflection question is, what was your definition of disability before reading this chapter? To chapter 34, which is about getting civically engaged, which are like, what causes do you care about that may impact the disability community? If you care about reproductive justice, do research on how reproductive justice impacts the disability community. Are there newsletters that you can join? So yeah, I think that, what was interesting was I got invited to an event with an Academy Award-winning director who's a woman. And I asked her, she had shared some stories during the event. She was one of the speakers about how she didn't share that she was pregnant, or I think like needing an extra, like not asking for an extra hotel room for her kids because they needed to travel with her somewhere. And I remember asking her after the panel if she thinks there's a shift. There's a lack of representation across a lot of different demographics. We're talking about accessibility on sets, but, women directors in the industry and writers. And she said that like, now that she has these receipts, like you get more say, right? You can advocate more. So I'm hoping that for the people who are more visible or who have made it, although I'm not quite sure what that means, that they will continue to be visible and advocate for things to be better. Because if you work with Marlee Matlin, you have to have interpreters on set. I've seen her cast, I think she did her first directing thing. She she's done some directing as well. And I hope she and other people are continuing to pave the way to make things more accessible. for other people who want to be in those roles as well. I mean, I even look at like the new Wicked movie that came out. One of the stars of the cast is a wheelchair user. And they made a Barbie that was inspired by her. And it's been incredible to see how excited the disability community is that she's there and that she was on the red carpet alongside, I believe the world premiere was just a couple of days ago. And that was amazing. And even in the Barbie movie, like if you look closely, there are a couple Barbies who have different types of disabilities that are featured throughout. So like you said, I think I'm seeing a shift, but I'm also not sure if it's because I'm getting older. And again, having more experience under my belt and surrounding myself around people who have been in this industry for a long time. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that a lot of the representation in the disability space that we are seeing now, some of it may be people who just decided to open their phone one day and started creating content, but a lot of these people have been doing this work for a really long time. And so, like, I don't believe in an overnight success. I think it's a slow burn. And in some ways, I feel really grateful to have been doing this work for 15 years because I have seen change. I know things can be so much better, but I also feel grateful that in my lifetime, I've been able to see and get to celebrate so many wins.
Would a little compassion go a long way as well?
I think a little compassion all around. So I know I have friends who have more apparent disabilities who a microaggression for them is getting offered help. And yeah, just like compassion all around. And what's interesting is sometimes on my injured arm, I'll wear a wrist splint. And every single time I wear my wrist splint, someone will ask me what happened. So if you can imagine just being out walking down the street and someone asks you what happened, someone asks me what happens on the bus, someone asks me what happened at the event, it becomes a lot, right? But I remind myself to have compassion as well, that this is that person's first time interacting with me. And it's not our job as disabled people to educate, but I have chosen this path for myself. And I also know that by making my experience more accessible to other people, it will, like, maybe that will help get them on board to advocating for accessibility in other spaces. So yeah, I think compassion goes a long way in everything too. We just don't know what people are going through at any particular point in time. And I think that with the hyper online culture that we're currently in, I think in some ways, some of us feel entitled to have a say in other people's lives, which doesn't necessarily feel super fair either.
Yeah, to say the least. Just because we can get online doesn't mean fine. I mean, everybody's welcome to express their opinions. You don't have to necessarily listen to it. So interesting. I want to, before we end this, because I know we're crunched for time, and because we're about spirituality and consciousness and really opening the heart chakra, is there a lot of trauma that you felt like you needed to cleanse or to release in order to find your voice? Or is that an ongoing process? Because you're very professional, you're very together, you definitely know your role, but I know there must be underlying things that weren't comfortable for you.
Yeah, in 2016, I read this book, Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. And when that book came out, I decided to want to lead with vulnerability. I will say now, fast forward 8 years after living many parts of my life extremely online. Like, you knew when I went on a first date, you knew when I went through a breakup. Like, I think I've decided there are certain parts of my life that are okay for just me and maybe my mental health team or my friends, my close friends, and that's okay. So I think to answer your question, so as we're recording this, yesterday was November 11th, which is 11/11, and I shared a post on social media about how on 11/11/2022, I got the offer for my book deal.
Wow.
And
That's so cool.
I know. And I shared a video from November 2022 where I was saying something along the lines of like, if you just surrender to the universe, things will happen. I want to put an asterisk in it that I don't want to diminish the 15 years of work and the 27 years of living in this disabled body that have led up to that. But I do think, Diana, that for a long time, I tried to control everything. I even remember very vividly, like not crying at my dad's funeral. And not that there's an expectation that that's what needs to show up, but I think about the suppression of my emotions for a long period of time. And there's a quote that I love.
Mhm.
It says, "The work of the mature person is to carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched large by it. How much sorrow can I hold? That's how much gratitude I can give." And I share that quote because I felt like grief, or like suppressed grief, was the only place that I could exist for a really long period of time. Again, as we're recording this, November is the anniversary of the car accident. It's Thanksgiving. It's my dad's birthday. He passed away the day after his birthday. It's just like a lot will come out this month. And it was only until 2016, which was 19 years after the car accident, that I viewed November as a month that I could, or even Thanksgiving, as a time where I could really reflect on gratitude.
Mhm.
So I've read The Body Keeps the Score. I was diagnosed with PTSD in 2019. That's 22 years after the car accident. I didn't label the car accident as trauma until 2016. I mean, we could do a whole part 2 podcast on kind of the emotional side of
Yes, please.
healing through this and who I've become. But I'm still working on it. And I think one thing I've had to learn is there's a reason why it's called a web of support or a support system, is that it's not just one thing. It's not just one person that I'm dependent on to continue to heal or even sit in my grief. It's how can I sprinkle all this fairy dust across a lot of different modalities to support my healing? And how can I also separate healing as an industry from healing as a practice? And I think I got caught up in the commodification of it, and that I wasn't doing it right for a long time, or that I didn't even know it was accessible to me. And yeah, I think a large part of it is that was like Tiffany again in her rabbit hole. Coming back on it, it's thinking about what that word surrender means to me and my own trust in the universe. And then also understanding that there's still self-work that needs to be done. And there's this old adage, time heals all wounds. And I updated it. Tiffany's version is time plus a lot of work heals some wounds. Again, I think about like 9-year-old Tiffany, and people often ask me like, what do you wish you could tell her? Or what do you wish you could say to her? And I was like, I wish someone just asked her how she was doing. There was so much fixation on the physical manifestation of what had happened that I think people forgot. And I don't shame, here's where compassion comes in again. It was a lot. It was a lot that happened. So I don't like shame or blame anyone, but I do wonder if we could have closed that 22-year gap of getting a PTSD diagnosis and exploring treatment and healing around that I could have started my journey of exploring like post-traumatic growth a little bit earlier. But it's okay. Or sorry, it's not okay. I trust in the universe. I trust. I think beautiful things happen when you just give up a little.
Absolutely.
I don't blame you for being controlling, I gotta say. I mean, at 9 years old, that's a lot. You lose your dad, you lose a part of yourself, and here you are. And I'm sure the healing is happening at exactly the right time, but my heart goes out to that little girl.
And it's been interesting too, because now I'm at an age where some of my friends have kids who are 9 and I'm hanging out with them. And I notice myself like getting emotional even thinking about it, because I have a hard time looking at this kid, my friend's kid, who's 9. And Lexi, I don't know how old your kids are, but like how, and there are other horrific things that happen to kids too. And I actually think in a broader conversation around grief, we don't talk enough about the loss of childhood innocence if you are a child. And I know there's a lot of conversation around like childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, but the grief of that, and making space and holding that too.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's your next book or your next TED Talk.
About grief?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. About grief, the loss of childhood innocence. I'm ready.
Yeah, I know.
Well, first I gotta finish book promo. And I appreciate you inviting me onto this podcast to talk about a very educational book, even though I think there's a lot of soul, there's a lot of healing, where I will also share that a lot of the healing is very specific to my own disability origin story. There are other people who did not acquire their disabilities in traumatic car accidents, who didn't lose a family member. And I want to make space for all of those stories too.
Tiffany,
Absolutely.
If people want to get in touch with you, or if they want to follow you on social, maybe book you for a speaking engagement potentially, or talk about your book, or if they're interested in learning more about your organizations, how should they find you?
Yeah, so the best place to go is my website, tiffanyyu.com. The last name is spelled Y-U, and it's Tiffany, like the jewelry company. And on there, you'll find links to all my social channels if you want to follow me or engage with me there. And you'll also find more information on the book.
Fabulous. And it's available on Amazon, correct?
Yes, it's available. It's available in print, audio, and ebook at wherever your favorite retailer or book retailer is. And if you've read the book, I have to put a shameless ask. If you've read the book, please leave a review. It really helps get more visibility for the book to reach more readers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Thank you for this conversation today. Thank you for your vulnerability and answering all of our questions, and for this really amazing conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Word for our sponsors, Oweli Supplements and CBD Pure, both whom have generously offered to give you 15% off using the SoulFam podcast coupon code SoulFam, SOULFAM, and free shipping. And trust me, when you're ordering stuff like this, it actually really adds up. You can save quite a bit of money, several dollars for every order. Both Lexi and I have worked with these products and their companies, and we have firsthand experience, and we really like these companies, sincerely. Oweli, OWELI.com, is a supplement company that uses natural ingredients based on ancient knowledge coupled with modern science, which sounds a lot like the SoulFam podcast. I am a huge supplement person. I take multiple supplements each day. The quality of Oweli supplements is high and effective, in my opinion. I take Move for joint health because I work out almost every day. I do yoga, I walk, I hike, I ride horses. And secondly, I mix collagen, peptides, hydrolyzed protein for a protein shake every day so I can be sure to get the right amount of protein in my body every day. And for women, I personally feel that's super important. CBD Pure, www.cbdpure.com, is made with non-GMO hemp grown without herbicides, pesticides, and other dangerous chemicals. Both Lexi and I feel like this is a stellar product. I use the CBD Pure 500 cream for pain in my neck from texting and working at a computer and a car accident I was in. Lexi uses CBD Pure Pet Health to help some of her posse of rescued cats who show up at her doorstep. They often have joint issues and other movement issues, and this product really seems to help Lexi's cats. Both products work superbly. No harmful side effects, at least from our experience. So once again, we thank our sponsors, CBD Pure and Oweli Supplements. We'll post links to both product lines on our Instagrams on my link tree and on YouTube and on our upcoming website, Patreon, Just remember the code for 15% off with free shipping, which once again adds up to a lot, is SOULFAM, SOULFAM. That's SOULFAM for our SOULFAM.